Meantime, the election countdown is on, and a number of down-ballot candidates appear to be dodging the vice president. Some vulnerable members of her party are even drawing connections with former President Trump in some new ads. Let's bring in Pete Seat. He is a GOP strategist. Pete, they say politics makes strange bedfellows, and that's happening in places like Pennsylvania, where Bob Casey, the Democrat Senate candidate, is tying himself to Donald Trump.
Yeah, Bob Casey is doing it in Pennsylvania. Sherrod Brown is doing it in Ohio. Tammy Baldwin is doing it in Wisconsin. Two of those, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, obviously critically important states to both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump in getting to 270 electoral college votes. But what's so interesting to me about this is the issues that they're focused on in these ads. Bob Casey is talking about trade, Tammy Baldwin about Made in America, Sherrod Brown about immigration and the border. They could run ads on just the issues themselves, but instead they decide to invoke Donald Trump, use images of Donald Trump in these ads. They are breaking up with Kamala Harris and flirting with Donald Trump because their political prospects depend on it.
So in a state like Pennsylvania, where Trump seems to be edging out Kamala Harris, I don't know if you want to call it easily, but he seems to have the lead there. A guy like Bob Casey figures it's not going to hurt him to tie himself to Donald Trump?
Well, if he's looking at internal polls that show that Donald Trump is starting to get a healthy lead in that state and Kamala Harris is starting to fall behind, yeah, he is going to put himself first and forget about Kamala Harris. Think back to June and July, right after the first presidential debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, when a lot of Senate Democrat incumbents, Sherrod Brown being one, John Tester in Montana being another, started to distance themselves from Joe Biden. They did not want him to weigh down their chances at re-election. What happened? Joe Biden ended up dropping out of that race. Here we are now, a fortnight and a couple days away from Election Day, and vulnerable Senate Democrats are starting to do the same with Kamala Harris. What does that portend for her campaign? Nothing good.
Yeah, well, what about the coattails of Kamala Harris, though? I mean, you know, it would seem that a sitting vice president would have some.
You would think so. But I think it's clear that Donald Trump has coattails and Kamala Harris does not. Look, this has never been about Kamala Harris since she has been the Democratic Party nominee. This is all about Kamala Harris not being Joe Biden and not being Donald Trump. That is what her campaign is based on. That is the foundation of her effort. Watch the interview with Bret Baier just a couple of nights ago on this very network. She couldn't even talk about what her own policy stances were because she doesn't have any. She doesn't actually have a vision for the future. All she had was attacks and negativity towards the former president because that's her entire campaign is, I'm not Donald Trump.
So let's go back to Pennsylvania, and I just find this fascinating because, you know, an incumbent Democratic senator from Pennsylvania is invoking and even using Donald Trump's image in his ads. What does that do for or maybe against David McCormick, the Republican candidate in that race?
Well, look, Bob Casey is also doing this because he's fashioned himself as a moderate, as a centrist throughout his political career, but he has been in lockstep with the unabashedly liberal Biden-Harris agenda. He, in fact, has voted with them not 80% of the time, not 90% of the time, but 98% of the time. Bob Casey has been with Biden Harris. So he needs to do something to pretend that he is a little closer to the middle. And that something is putting Donald Trump in his ads, which, look, he's now put a target on him. Donald Trump is going to take note. The Trump campaign already has. They've been blasting out emails about these particular ads. And you can bet that Trump is going to put his sights on Bob Casey and the others. It's going to backfire on them.
The Senate is, you know, very much up for grabs, but Republicans are feeling that they have a pretty good chance to make, to get control of the Senate. Are there other states in which Democrat candidates are tying themselves to Donald Trump, or trying to?
Yeah, so Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, as I said, Sherrod Brown in Ohio, Alyssa Slotkin, who's a member of Congress, a House member right now in Michigan, is the Democrat nominee. She's doing it as well. And, the most dangerous thing a political prognosticator can do is get ahead of themselves. And in this case, that's getting ahead of polls, because the polls of today are not necessarily the results of tomorrow. Anything can happen, but this is something we need to pay attention to, that Democrats are trying to tie themselves to Donald Trump. And keep in mind, too, this is not just about the majority in the Senate, which Republicans have a very, very high probability of capturing, but this could also determine which members win and end up in the caucus, could determine who replaces Mitch McConnell as majority leader. You get more Republican senators to win. That's a larger voting pool of senators in the caucus. And these folks who were not necessarily expected to win could be the decision makers in that race.
All right, Pete Seat, Republican strategist. Pete, thanks very much.
Click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You won't get it anywhere else.